Good evening, friends. Good evening, friends, and welcome to the Stephen G. Cary Memorial Lecture for 2019. It's the 13th annual lecture that we have held here at Pendle Hill, and we're delighted to see all of you this evening. My name is John Meyer, and I'm the Communications and Outreach Coordinator here at Pendle Hill. And the first thing I would like to do after saying welcome is to ask you if you'd be so kind as to pull out your cell phones and turn them off or put them on silent or whatever you need to do. If you have people that you are attending to, please put it on buzz or whatever. But if you can turn it off, that would be even better. Another thing I would like to let you know, because I always put our remind folks that we are here in the barn at Pendle Hill, but we are also live streaming this event, and there are probably about an equal number of people who are viewing this from the comfort of their homes or from their meeting house with a group of other people. So welcome to all of you who are seeing this from a distance. That being said, one of the important things we'll want to do after we hear Diane Randall's message this evening is to have an opportunity for question and answer. And so Diane will choose from the array of hands that get raised, and I will come around with the microphone, and if you will observe where I'm holding it, the folks at home will be able to hear your question as well as Diane's response to your question or comment. Now for our commercial interlude, briefly. This is part of our first Monday lecture series, and next month, on the first Monday of May, we will be having Taya Sepanuk and her colleague who work with the Theater of Witness, police officers in Philadelphia and people in the communities of color that are being policed, tell their stories in this Theater of Witness workshop called Walk in My Shoes. And that evening we will see a film with both the director and the producer here with an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. It will not be live streamed, so I urge you to register to be here in the barn. So thank you very much, and without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to the Executive Director of Pendle Hill, Jen Karsten, to introduce our special guest.
Good evening, friends. Am I hearable to the back? Hearable? Welcome to Pendle Hill. Welcome to springtime in Pennsylvania. We are gathered for the annual Steve Cary Memorial Lecture. For these annual lectures, Pendle Hill invites a Quaker of long standing whose life reflects some of Steve Cary's commitments and attributes. Before his death at age 86 in 2002, he lived a really rich life and had a career in varied leadership positions in Friends institutions. He was a person of courage and conviction, and who had a long commitment to peace through justice, and also a lifelong commitment to the Religious Society of Friends. He was fun-loving and tough-minded and smart and told great stories. And I think that tonight's speaker, Diane Randall, is a wonderful embodiment of all of those characteristics. And thank goodness that she brings that brilliance on behalf of Friends to Capitol Hill. Diane is the Executive Secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, or FCNL. For 8 years, she has led FCNL's work to effectively educate and lobby for policies and legislative priorities established by friends in order to create a better, more peaceful world for everybody. Diane knows that this vision of a world centered in friends' testimonies is often at odds with political life. But the effort to see an equal measure of the divine in every person is a discipline that shapes her patient and persistent approach to lobbying. Diane travels widely on behalf of FCNL and represents a voice for Quaker advocacy in Washington, within our faith community more broadly, in the media, and throughout the United States. I can also comment on behalf of the Pendle Hill staff, as I was sharing with her and her colleague Sarah this evening, that often when Pendle Hill staff go across the country to meet with Friends of Pendle Hills to ask what's alive for you in the Society of Friends today, what's giving you inspiration, they'll comment that Diane Randall is pretty special. And yes, we agree. She's a member of Hartford Monthly Meeting in New England, but worships with Langley Hill Friends in Virginia. She's a graduate of the University of Nebraska, and following that has served on a range of nonprofit boards. She's married to Roger Catlin and is the mother of Alex, Lily, and Nora. Her talk tonight is titled Tumult, Turmoil, and Truth, Vital Quaker Witness Today. Friends, at Pendle Hill, it is our custom to settle into a worshipful silence, holding our speaker in care, and when she's ready, she'll rise to share her message with us. So I invite you to join me now in welcoming Diane's message in this way.
Well, thank you, Jen, for welcoming me and for asking me to offer this Stephen Cary lecture, to be part of the rich tradition of education, worship, and spiritual deepening that is this place. I want to acknowledge Dorothy Cary in the audience, my delight to meet her this evening. And I also have to acknowledge my predecessor, Joe Volk, who surprises me in being here. It is always a treat to see Joe, and it used to be only about once a year that I got to see him, and now I expect it will be more frequently. Pendle Hill is, of course, an important institution in the life of Friends today, as it has been for almost 90 years. And I speak to you this evening as the head of another important Quaker institution, the Friends Committee on National Legislation. We advance effective public policies through federal legislation. That's the heart of FCNL's mission, to build political will for legislation and for the public policy changes that reflect Quaker priorities. FCNL fields a lobbying team in Washington, D.C. that brings subject matter expertise to congressional offices. Coupled with constituent voices, FCNL offers a compelling message for peace, for social justice, and environmental sustainability by empowering civil dialogue for policy change. In my experience of nearly 35 years that I have worshiped with Friends, and in the 8 years since I've served as Executive Secretary of FCNL, it's my experience that Quakers offer the world a vital faith and practice that is relevant and alive, and that Quaker institutions offer depth and breadth to those who hunger for a life in the Spirit. So let me repeat that message, which may not be new to you, but which I think is really important for us to claim. Quakers and Quaker institutions bring value to the world, a world that is troubled and in turmoil, a world seeking truth. How do we encourage, cultivate, and enable the flourishing of this rich faith and practice to create the world we seek? Test this in your own life, in the life of your Quaker meetings, or in the life of Quaker institutions that you may be attached to. The call of the mission-driven life, the essence of our deep listening for divine revelation, our pursuit of truth, our practice to let love be the first motion, is essential for who we are as the Religious Society of Friends and for how we show up every day in the world. In my spiritual formation as a friend, I learned this practice of inward listening both individually and corporately. I learned to love my meeting for the space and structure it provided to my religious and spiritual life. As a convinced friend, it took some time to figure out how silent worship and vocal ministry worked, and how my local meeting related to the Quakers in New England, across the U.S., and even throughout the world. But I began to see the value of Quaker institutions alive in the Religious Society of Friends. I read Pendle Hill pamphlets. I attended the Friends General Conference consultations. I served on the advisory board of the Earlham School of Religion. And I drove my children and many other children from my own meeting to the New England Yearly Meeting youth retreats and attended annual sessions. I saw the value that these organizations and institutions had and have in my life. I relished the community of friends, and I learned ways of simplifying by watching and listening to friends. I saw how friends let their lives speak, and I knew that I wanted my life to speak to others as well. Recently, like in the last 2 weeks, when I was worshiping at Friends Meeting in Washington and then at Hartford Meeting last week, I began reflecting about the communion of saints. It has come to me more than once, and it's been in different places, as I said, that when I worship, that friends who have died are still present with those of us in the waiting worship. There is a mystical sense of presence as if they inhabit the space. Now, it's possible that they only are inhabiting my heart and soul, but their vocal ministry and wisdom still speak to me. In the Apostles' Creed, which is a statement of belief that binds many Christian denominations in liturgy, the last part of the creed, one that I recited every week growing up in the Lutheran Church, says, "I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting." Now, of course, Quakers don't have a creed. We don't all believe the same thing, and I'm guessing not many Quakers would agree with that sentence. I don't fully agree with it either, but I do believe some of it. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the communion of saints, and the forgiveness of sins. For a long time, before I became a Quaker and I wasn't really attending church, and after I became a Quaker, I didn't think of sin. Now I do. In naming the value that I see in Quaker faith and practice for confronting the tumult and turmoil of the world, I don't mean to imply that Quakers are the only people who feel a call to the mission-driven life. There are plenty of other people of faith, people who profess no particular faith, but are deeply drawn to living a life from a morally grounded heart and soul. In fact, one of the joys of my work in Washington, D.C. is advocating with colleagues on an interfaith basis and recognizing the communion of saints with Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Buddhists, and Christian brothers and sisters. Together, we see the possibility of a world where every person is seen as a beloved child of God, and together we work on federal policies that lead us to that world. And of course, as Quakers, we certainly aren't pure. We don't always experience divine revelations, and we are sometimes known to be a bit standoffish, self-righteous, and even testy in our peculiarity. So when I say that Quakers and Quakers institutions bring value to the world to confront the turmoil of the world, I want to say it as an encouragement and challenge to you to step fully into who we are and how we are called, to invite others to join us in these Quaker institutions, and to acknowledge that what attracts people to Quakers often is our witness in the world, in living lives that speak. Steve and Cary was that kind of Quaker. I didn't know Steve, but I have been delighted to read the rich stories of his life in The Intrepid Quaker. From his role providing humanitarian relief in Europe following World War II, to his acts of civil disobedience in witness to securing food assistance for millions of poor Americans, to his leadership at the AFSC and Haverford, Steve followed a calling for humanitarian service in the world. Abraham Heschel, the Jewish theologian who wrote about the role of biblical prophets and their call to justice, asks this: "How shall I live the life that I am? How shall I live the life that I am?" Over the past couple of years, I've been dipping in and out, not quite reading the whole book, but looking at Heschel's book, The Prophets. And it's helped me understand something about prophetic witness. He states that the main task of prophetic thinking is to bring the world into divine focus. Seeking a world free of war and the threat of war, a society with equity and justice for all, a community where every person's potential may be fulfilled, and an earth restored, is prophetic thinking. Last Tuesday, on the final day of FCNL's Spring Lobby Weekend, we gathered at the Lutheran Church on Capitol Hill for a rousing send-off as the young adults who had been thoroughly trained and prepped to meet their members of Congress scattered across the Capitol Hill to congressional offices to ask them for a just immigration policy. 500 young adults from 37 states attended this Spring Lobby Weekend, and over the course of 4 days heard from FCNL's colleague organizations who work to end detention, deportation, and border militarization. They heard from staff in congressional offices about what makes a successful lobby visit, how telling their own stories can be the most powerful way to make a case to elected officials. And they heard from the FCNL staff, Hannah Graff Evans and Gabby Vieira, our lobbyist and program assistant, who are FCNL's experts and lead this issue for us on Capitol Hill. On that morning, Representative Linda Sanchez of California stood up to address them, and she told her own story, how she was the sixth of 7 children born to Mexican immigrant parents, how her parents had very limited educations but worked hard to make it possible for their children to go to college and be successful, and how her mother, after raising 7 children, went back to obtain her GED and attend college to become a teacher. But the power of what she said about everyday acts of courage is what resonated for me. Ms. Sanchez spoke about the heroism of Rosa Parks, not giving up her seat on the bus, and the spark that that created. But the hundreds of Black Montgomery citizens who refused to ride the buses and instead who walked long miles to church or to work or to shop over the course of many months are the everyday heroes of the civil rights movement. I love that she told this story to a room of 18 to 25-year-olds, that they begin to comprehend from a member of U.S. Congress that it isn't a single action by a celebrity or an elected official that makes change. It is the everyday courage of individuals. It is people listening to their inner light that guides them to right action. In my remarks to these young activists, I encourage them to use the opportunity of the FCNL Spring Lobby Weekend to become effective advocates for their lifetimes, dedicated to social justice. While a single act can spark change, it is through the countless actions of individuals who see themselves tied in a single garment of destiny, an inescapable network of mutuality, as Martin Luther King declares, that we will make a difference. Marjorie Post Abbott's most recent book, Walk Humbly, Serve Boldly, Modern Quakers as Everyday Prophets, has given me the encouragement and acceptance to regard my own work at FCNL as prophetic witness. Okay, so this is not a title or a role that comes easily to me, but Marge is casting everyday prophets as, I quote, a people who seek to pay attention to the nudges and visions of the Spirit on a daily or even a minute-by-minute basis, to live in accord with the guidance they receive to help others know the inward teacher and holy guide. Well, that does feel truthful for my condition. Are you an everyday prophet? Here's another definition. Everyday prophets are people who are faithful to the path of truth and love and whose lives project hope and a passion for justice. This path is at the core of Quaker worship and spiritual discipline. Do our institutions, including our meetings and churches, project hope and passion for justice? Are we faithful to the path of truth and love? Do we, in the words of the prophet Micah, love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with our God? Do we, as Abraham Heschel describes prophets, bring the world into divine focus? People often ask me, how do you stay hopeful? Actually, someone asked me this past weekend, even in a more plaintive way, do you see any hope? I understand why people say this. There are decisions made by the governmental power structure in this country and in countries around the world that are a threat to humanity. People across the globe are being killed in deadly conflict by weapons made in the United States. The U.S. military is fueling Saudi Arabian airplanes that are wreaking a terrible humanitarian disaster in the country of Yemen. Civilians are being killed and starved. What we have known as the existential threat of nuclear war is still with us, and now the threat is renewed with the so-called low-yield nuclear weapons and the $1 trillion price tag for modernization of a nuclear force in the next decade. The vision of shared security that FCNL and AFSC jointly developed, actually at a consultation here at Pendle Hill a few years back, is difficult to see in the actions of our country right now. The president has slammed the door shut on diplomacy, from decertifying the Iran deal to pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord to ignoring the diligent labor required to advance diplomatic agreements. Witness North Korea. While the opening created by Trump's embrace of Kim Jong-un offered an unprecedented opportunity for North and South Korea, the president walked away from the summit with no apparent deal. The United States is one of the biggest contributors to carbon output of the world, yet we are pulling back on the commitments we made to the 190 nations that signed the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. Moreover, to the families and neighborhoods that have counted on the protections of the Environmental Protection Agency. Last year, 3 separate reports issued dire warnings about the shortness of time and the growing threat of global warming and eroding biodiversity. Yet our Congress resists meaningful action. At the same time, the administration is radically retrenching through reductions in the federal budget and federal agencies to meet human needs. Our government, for the people, by the people, and of the people, is being twisted to serve a narrow segment of our society, further fueling vast income inequality. The structural racism built into our public policies over generations that subjugate people with brown or black skin to different standards, from criminal justice to public education to healthcare to housing opportunity, is now more overt with brazen demands and displays from white nationalists. The grievous acts of white supremacy exhibited in Charlottesville and perpetuated in our border policies today manifest the practices that people of color have experienced throughout their lives. Behavior that demeans, degrades, and rejects other than white. The fault lines of whiteness that make true equality a lie are deep and touch every one of us. And so now I come back to the problem of sin. Because these sins, defiling the air, the water, and the earth, putting human beings in cages, leaving people on the streets to sleep and sometimes to die, spending our governmental resources on nuclear weapons, exporting armaments and violence to countries across the globe, resisting actions to end the scourge of gun violence, the hatred, harm, and indifference experienced as a reality for too many human beings, these are structural sins. And all of us are complicit, even when we work not to be. These structural or social sins are different than the personal wrongdoing, which is how I grew up thinking of sin. And I don't so much think of these as sins to be forgiven as to be recognized as that which distances us from God, which is the opposite of holiness. There is a truth-telling in naming these structural sins and injustice that cause turmoil and division in order to move toward the conditions that foster equality, peace, community, and integrity. In spite of all this sin, this turmoil and trouble, do I see hope? Yes, I do. In the words of Elizabeth Fry, Quaker prison reformer and philanthropist who lived from 1780 to 1845, I look not to myself, but to that within me that has to my admiration proved to be my present help and enabled me to do what I believe of myself I could not have done. So what keeps me hopeful? Well, here's the laundry list of activity from FCNL. In January of 2019, the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act became law when President Trump signed the bill. This legislation equips the U.S. government with constructive and cost-effective tools to address the root causes of violent conflict. FCNL led the strategy and lobbying that resulted in the bill's passage in the House and Senate. Now, this success came after a decade of work and leadership to build strong bipartisan consensus in Congress for proactive peace building. In the coming week, we expect that the House will vote once again to reassert congressional authority over when the U.S. goes to war by invoking the War Powers Act to end the U.S. involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. FCNL's advocacy paved the way for this historic bipartisan votes in the Senate and the House, educating members of Congress about U.S. complicity in this massive humanitarian crisis, mobilizing grassroots advocates across the country, and we helped lead the faith community's lobbying to end the illegal war. And late last year, President Trump signed into legislation the most significant federal criminal justice reform in years. This new law reduces long prison sentences for nonviolent crimes and improves rehabilitation for those currently in prison. We help provide leadership and again in the faith community for criminal justice reform. Now, I want to note that the name of this legislation is the First Step Act, and it truly is a first step. It did not do everything that we believed was important, but it is a first step. And I want to speak about the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which includes provisions to address Native American women's safety. Just last month, Representative Karen Bass and Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, the 1st District, introduced H.R. 1585, which is a bill to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. And within that, which is a massive piece of legislation, it included provisions that would strengthen the protections for Native American women, children, and tribal officers. It expands tribal jurisdiction over non-Indians to include crimes of sexual assault, stalking, sex trafficking, and child abuse. These provisions will help address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women by improving responses to missing cases through better communication. We don't know whether that amendment to the Violence Against Women Act will pass, but we're working to assure that it stays in. And finally, let me mention the first significant act that has happened to try to address gun violence in well over a decade. The House's passage of the Bipartisan Background Checks Act in February of 2019 is the first crack in the barrier that has prevented any sensible gun legislation in passing Congress. This is a bill that requires universal background checks for all gun sales, and it closes a loophole for gun sales that are done online or in gun shows. Again, our work is to work with other faith groups to help give a moral voice to this legislation. Here's what else gives me hope. Those 500 young adults who are fearless advocates for social justice and peace, who bring passion, intelligence, and commitment and love to their advocacy. The 200 young adults who will apply to work at FCNL as young fellows, summer interns, and advocacy corps members. Sadly, we only have positions for about 20% of those who apply. The power of constituent voices to influence Congress, our FCNL advocacy teams, visiting friends, meetup motivators, people across the country who are everyday prophets, who are called to act and find a community with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. But above all, I am buoyed by the essential hopefulness that we have in our practice of waiting worship, of gathering together and expectant listening to the Holy Spirit, and staying open to how this inward experience shapes my outward action. And I'll just say as an aside, there is really no corporate silence I don't love these days. I want you to spend a moment with me imagining what might be possible with our Quaker institutions. What if we claim the power of our faith and practice to live in the presence of the divine in this world of tumult with a radical faithfulness? What if those 500 young adults who come to FCNL through our young adult programs or through Pendle Hill's Continuing Revolution started to consistently attend Quaker meetings because they were captured by the welcoming and inclusive communities of our meetings and churches? What if in the coming year, every one of you in this room committed to visiting offices of your two senators and representative to tell your story, to establish a presence for peace and justice, and to build a relationship with those members of Congress? What if every week that Congress is in session, a group of advocates would travel to Washington, D.C., pack the Quaker Welcome Center to be trained to lobby, and then go out from our place on Capitol Hill and lobby? What if Congress reclaims its constitutional authority over war and votes to repeal the 2001 and 2002 authorization for the use of military force to end the endless war? What if they passed a no first use of nuclear weapons and they commit to diplomacy and peace building as the most effective foreign policy? What if both the Republican and Democratic leadership of Congress and the administration together figured out that a fair carbon tax is an immediate and positive solution to the problem of climate change? What if the iconic words on the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," actually meant that we welcome the stranger to our country, refugees and immigrants? What if we practice loving our neighbors without exception every day? In 1974, our first executive secretary, E. Raymond Wilson, wrote these words that have even deeper resonance today, I think. Why try to work uphill for peace, justice, and freedom on Capitol Hill at a time when cynicism about the character and operation of government and government officials is widespread, and the disillusionment about the church and organized religion is so common and so vocal? Because religion should be vital and relevant, and because the health and the future of our democracy rests upon responsible participation by informed and concerned citizen. This message resonates in 2019 as much as it did in 1974 when Raymond Wilson wrote it, or in 1943 when FCNL was founded. In the same way, William Penn's message from 300 years ago still resonates. True godliness does not turn men out of the world, but enables them to live better in it, and excites their endeavors to mend it. How do we encourage, cultivate, and enable the flourishing of this rich faith and practice to create the world we seek? How are we speaking truth to power? As a Quaker institution, FCNL has committed ourselves to change public policy to support peace, justice, social justice, and environmental sustainability. We are committed to grow and strengthen our network of grassroots advocates across the country, to expand our media and marketing outreach to tell our story, and we are committed to stay grounded in our Quaker faith and practice. After I had worked at FCNL for only a few months back in 2011, I had a strong conviction that more people should become Quakers and that more people should know about the Friends Committee on National Legislation. I began to understand evangelism. I will say that as I have had the opportunity to get to know friends across the country and to know more Quaker organizations and institutions, my belief in what we as the Religious Society of Friends have to offer the world only increases. Quakers and Quaker institutions like Pendle Hill and FCNL, like many of our Quaker schools and college, AFSC, the Quaker United Nations office, and I could go on and on, we all bring value to this world, a world that is troubled, a world that is seeking truth. At a time when people are looking to make meaning of the political, social, and cultural turmoil, the moral grounding of Friends provides a firm foundation. This Quaker grounding is a place to stand, a place to build community, to find both challenge and support, and to renew our spirits, to seek truth. Steve Cary's ministry was profound and distinct, and his longing to instill the depth of Quaker witness into the institutions he poured himself into deeply resonates with me. Yet I know that neither Steve Cary, nor E. Raymond Wilson, nor any weighty Quaker, nor any of the communion of saints, the valiant procession of friends who precede us, not even any of the everyday prophets will alone create the world we seek. It is together, as we live into that which is holy, that we have hope, that we are able to love one another without exception. And like Elizabeth Fry, I look not to myself, but to that which is within me, that has to my admiration proved to be my present help, and enabled me to do what I believe of myself I could not have done. Thank you. So this is really my favorite part, to do questions and answers. So I'm happy to take questions or comments, and I think John's going to be our mic runner this evening.
I will.
And would you please introduce yourselves if you have a question or comment?
If you will speak right into it.
Hi, my name is Shoshana Osofsky, and I'm here with two friends from the Greenwich meeting in Salem Quarter in New Jersey. And we're also members of American Promise, which is a nonpartisan group working to to craft consensus language for a constitutional amendment to address the independent expenditures that have been unleashed since the Supreme Court Citizens United decision, making it much more difficult to get substantive change on climate change, on criminal justice reform, on peacemaking, the things that we care about. So Friends bring a unique wisdom in the area of civic engagement. Will FCNL stand with us and actively collaborate with American Promise to work on consensus language for this amendment?
Thanks for the question. I'm not familiar with American Promise, but I am familiar, obviously, with the effort to try to upend Citizens United because of the negative effects it has had on money and politics. To just say a word about how our legislative priorities and our policy is set, which is a great opportunity for me to talk about what we hope you're all doing in your meetings in churches, is doing the revision of the FCNL policy. So staff doesn't make the decision about which issues we pick. That's made by Quakers around the country. So Friends have an opportunity every 2 years to, in their own local meetings, set out what legislative priorities we take on. But around policy, which is kind of like the bigger overarching statement, we are now in a year where we're revising our policy. So this is really the year to inject that into the policy. And so I encourage you to do that through your own meeting, and certainly this might raise this for other friends in this audience to think about whether they might too. So just to say a word, just because you raise it doesn't mean it gets in there. This is a Quaker process, and so we have a very robust governance structure at FCNL. We have 7 standing committees, and our policy committee then reviews all of the input they get. And so then based on that input, make a decision in terms of a policy document that will come back to the general committee. But I hear what you're saying, and I will tell you that when we did the last year was the year that we did our the priorities statement. We consistently hear from many meetings that the issue of, I'm going to say it broadly, not specifically America's Promise, but the issue of money in politics is people see as a real root problem that's driving a lot of dysfunction in our system.
Well, we'll keep lobbying you.
Thank you. This is the thing, is you teach people how to lobby and then they practice all the time.
Right.
It's good.
Another.
I'm Marty Smith.
Hi, Marty.
Hi, from Moorestown meeting in Moorestown, New Jersey. We have a fairly active young friends group within our meeting, and one of the young friends said to me, please ask Diane Randall when the next opportunity is for us to go do some volunteer work, lobbying work with FCNL in Washington, D.C. Can you tell me when her next opportunity would be?
Wednesday. Come down Wednesday. I'm serious. We do something. So last 2 years ago, I mean, I think a lot of you know because a lot of you helped support our capital campaign. But one of the things we did in our capital campaign was use it to renovate the building next door to us into a Quaker Welcome Center. Now, I just need to say it's Washington, D.C. space, so it's not big. You know, it's not like a residential, beautiful campus, but it is a lovely spot. And every Wednesday, we do lobby training. We hold what we call Witness Wednesday, and Sarah Holtzclaw, who is our young adult working with Christine Ashley, who some of you know, Quaker Field Secretary, leads a training on Wednesday morning. Every Wednesday at 5:15, we hold a period of silent reflection there. Now, some schools and let me see, I'm trying to think if we've had actual meetings. Pittsburgh Friends Meeting brought a group down one Wednesday as a meeting group. It was like maybe 6, and it wasn't young people, but we would welcome that. And I've had conversations, when I was at New England Yearly Meeting last session, Gretchen Baker Smith, I don't know if anybody knows Gretchen, but Gretchen Baker Smith convenes that group, and she said, Diane, will you come talk to my group? And I said, sure, I'll come talk to them. And so we're talking to the middle school group, and at the end I said, you guys all like to take one of your retreats down in Washington, D.C. I said, get Gretchen and all these other adults to bring you down for like, a long weekend, and you can all come lobby with us. Gretchen kind of looked at me like, But I actually think it's a great opportunity for a meeting to think about whether, that's a lot to organize. And I know it's not literally, you can't jump in the car and come down. But I think it offers an opportunity intergenerationally for people to advocate together. The challenge is it doesn't happen on weekends, right? You got to come when the Congress is in session, which is generally midweek. So that's part of the reason we encourage people to come down. At the same time, we are offering a lot of training programs to people and ways that people can jump onto phone calls and learn more about it so that you don't have to leave your home either. I mean, you can lobby in district, and we encourage people to do that. Typically, I think many people know that the congressional offices in Washington, D.C. tend to have the staff who have expertise in subject issue areas. So like the foreign policy staff are in Washington, or the probably environmental policy people are in Washington. The district offices tend to have constituent workers. That's not to say that they aren't informed or don't know. It's just that they generally are more doing constituent issues as opposed to, in-depth issues. But we would welcome participation.
Norval Reese from Newtown Friends Meeting. Diane, first, thank you very much. I mean, that was really a superb walk through the forest. If I want to ask you to do something unusual, step out of your Quaker role as an official and tell us, those of us who are getting brain dead because of the barrage of news from Washington, what are your personal top priorities for public policy right now, if you had to? Your top three, if you had to say that, just as a Quaker individual who happens to be in the nation's capital.
Yeah.
And knows a few things.
Well, that's a great question. It's so let me just say a little bit about working and living in Washington. I was having. Sarah and I were together this morning. Sarah, I want to introduce Sarah Kennedy, my colleague from Friends Committee on National Legislation, who's here. Sarah and I were with someone this morning. Yes, you can applaud her. She's wonderful. Sarah and I were with someone this morning, and she started saying, well, what about this, and what about that, and what about this? I said, sometimes it's just hard to keep up. Like, really, every 4 hours, there's like a new, what? What just happened? And so there is a little bit of a head spinning, that goes on. And one of the benefits, I think, of FCNL is that we try to keep a focus, and so we try to really stay focused on the issue that we're working on and not be distracted by all of the other things that are going on, which need attention. That's just not the attention we're going to provide. I will tell you that working on climate change was a new issue for me when I came to FCNL. I was aware, but I wasn't really hadn't done much with it. This past year, I think, I'm sure with other people as well, I think just has hit me in a very profound way. And that we are seeing the kind of dire warnings, not only from scientific reports, but from people's lived lives, wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, just rising sea levels, the kind of responses that the U.S. military is having to what they have to do to their bases. It's unprecedented, and yet there's no action. And so I think that, if I could say one thing that I would like to see happen, that would probably be, one of the most important actions that could be taken to do something that is meaningful to try to address this. I'd say the other thing that I'm finding, I mentioned, where I find hope. I think the movements by young people in this country that are happening are so stunning. So, March for Our Lives, we're seeing global action by young teenagers on climate change. And some of it is social media. They're capturing people's imagination and attention. But when you talk, we've gotten to know some of the folks that are active with March for Our Lives. And when you talk to them, they are like on fire in a way that is so directed and so instructive. honestly. I mean, we learn from them, you know, and so I see that among the people who are active with FCNL as well. So, I think what's important is not to say, oh, you take care of it, you know, that's going to be your generation's issue. No, we all have something to do about that, and we ought to be supportive and allies and be doing everything we can, but we can learn from a younger generation. So I think that's really hopeful. And then the last thing I want to just say about the issues around, we were talking about like how, I was actually talking with Arthur at dinner about how the changes in the Religious Society of Friends that are so evident. And I would say that I think one of the interesting things that, when, and Joe can certainly speak for himself, but I think in the last, decade before I came to FCNL, there was a huge focus, obviously, on the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and, the devastating, sort of devastating decision that was and the impact it had. So you've probably seen stories that talk about the fact that there are men and women eligible to serve in the military who weren't alive when 9/11 happened, who weren't alive when we, signed that, when the authorization for the use of military force happened. And we're still fighting those wars in ways that no longer make the headlines. They're kind of on the back pages. And yet we're going to spend, the president proposed a $750 billion defense budget. In Steve Cary's book, I was just rereading this part, 2002, the defense budget was, I think, $305 billion. That's not that long ago, and we've doubled it. And supposedly we're not at war. I mean, you wouldn't say, if I said, is America at war? You probably wouldn't say, I mean, you might say yes, because you guys pay attention to this. But a lot of people wouldn't say, no, we're not fighting a war. Oh yeah, that one in Afghanistan? Oh yeah. So I think that for us, that ability to say to Congress, your job in the Constitution is that you have to declare war. So pay attention, take your job back. Don't let the executive cede this to the executive, whether the executive is Donald Trump or Barack Obama or whoever may come next. That's Congress's job. They represent us. That's the part of the democracy. So there are, there's brokenness in the system of campaign finance, but there's also brokenness in, kind of some of their willingness to cede power. So anyway, I could go on. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Oh, did you have a call? I saw two hands, but not at the same time. I'll get back to you.
Hi, my name's Kathy Boone. I'm from Buffalo, New York. And I'm curious to know, especially given the length of time that you've been in your position and what a highly polarized political environment we seem to have at this point in time, what has been the experience of FCNL lobbyists in this changing environment? I mean, with a, progressive agenda, what kind of reception do you find that you're getting in, I'll just say it, Republican offices these days? And has it changed over time?
One of the ways that I have inhabited this role is that I don't carry my own portfolio of issues, and so I don't go on the Hill a lot unless someone invites me to go with them, which I love when they do because I actually like to lobby a lot. So I'm not sure if I can say comprehensively, but what I will say is that overall, FCNL enjoys, I think, very positive relationships in many Republican offices, particularly in offices that we've worked with for a period of time. And we're careful about cultivating those relationships and maintaining them and finding where there is a place of commonality. There isn't always, and there might be on one issue or one part of one issue, and so we work to build from that. You probably are aware that a lot of our lobbying in Washington, the people who we hire who are legislative directors, lead programs, their lobbying is mostly staff to staff. So they're working with the congressional staff. And for us, we consider it successful if those congressional staff people actually reach out to us and ask us to come in and talk about the legislation or call us or check with us. or who might convene a group to come talk to them. I think that FCNL is the largest peace lobby in Washington, D.C. Now, that's something to be proud of, and it's something to be dismayed about, right? We have 4 full-time lobbyists plus, 5 full-time lobbyists actually, plus program assistants. So people know us and know sort of what we represent, and I think that's important. I'll also say to you that I did spend some time on the Hill in the summer of 2017 when the Affordable Care Act was being debated. And, there's that really tense vote when we had Senator Murkowski and Collins and McCain voted in opposition to their party. And we went on a lot of lobby visits. And I remember being in Senator Quaker's office, who we know a little bit because he's no longer in office, but he was the Republican chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But we went in to talk to his office about the ACA and preserving it. And his staff in particular said to us, it is so, we were with a group of faith leaders, he said, it is so important that you're here. It is so important that the moral voice is being heard on this issue. And we hear that again and again from both Republicans and Democrats. They know that there's a dimension of their work that goes beyond money, that goes beyond special interests. And, I can't say that they all have that, but somewhere people want that. There is a hunger in our souls, for a moral grounding. And so if we can speak to that, it has meaning. So we are all about training people to talk to every member of Congress. And you can imagine it's different. So, I've just come from Connecticut, and my Connecticut people are all like, oh, our members are great. We've got Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal. And it's like, yeah. And they all support a $750 billion defense budget. Okay? There's work to do, So whether, you have a Democrats that you think are wonderful or you have Republicans you think are like, okay, they're doing a good job. I mean, we always ask people to find something to thank their members of Congress about, when they go in. We ask people to think about how to tell your story. It was particularly important around immigration, as we had all those people in there. But the other thing that we do is to say to people who are working with offices, we've worked with we have an advocacy team in Richmond, Indiana, who's really struggled, The guy, I can't remember the guy who just lost, but the seat in Richmond, Indiana, the rep is now Greg Pence, Mike Pence's brother, right? Who has similar views. And, sometimes these offices are resistant to having people come in. And so the beauty of this sort of distributed advocacy network that we've created is we have times for phone calls. And so it's not someone from my office, the FCNL staff, oh, try this. It's someone from an Oklahoma district who also was having a hard time getting in to see their member who said, we tried this and it worked, or we had this, so it's good to have that kind of community where people are supporting one another. And, what's always great, so I'll tell you one more story about Republican office, because this is a great story. A couple years ago, I got invited to be the resident friend at North Pacific yearly meeting. And so that means you go and you get to hang out mostly. I guess you give a talk, but it was really fun. Wyoming, there are Quakers in Wyoming, and Wyoming yearly meeting, there are this many, I got to know a woman there, and we actually ended up flying out together and spending a couple of hours in Salt Lake City together at the airport. And Georgiana is her name, and I really encouraged her I said, think about coming to the FCNL annual meeting. Because I feel like if people come to the FCNL annual meeting, then they get excited, because it's a pretty awesome event. So I said, come to the FCNL annual meeting. And so she talked to us, and she got Christine Ashley, our Quaker field secretary, to go out and do a training out there for about, maybe was their gathering, their regional gathering or something. And they got excited, and they sent 3 friends to our annual meeting in 2017. So if you live in a state that doesn't have a big population, the chances that you're going to get a meeting with a member of Congress directly is really good. So Wyoming, Rhode Island, Alaska, you come into Washington, the chances are. So they had a meeting with Liz Cheney, who was the one representative. And they were really worried. They were really worried going into that meeting. They said, we're going to find, what do we say? Thank you, fund. We're not going to find anything to agree on. They got into the meeting, they came back, and they said, that was an awesome meeting. We had a great conversation. You know, they were lobbying, I'm trying to remember what we were lobbying on, maybe on mass incarceration, but they found something they could agree on. And the other point of what happened in that meeting is they said, we told her that we were kind of afraid to go in and talk to her. And Liz Cheney said, I was kind of afraid to talk to you guys too.
Thank you.
Tom Sharpless, Germantown meeting. I was at the annual meeting 2 years ago, I think. You had just opened the
Quaker Welcome Center.
Quaker Center there, and someone told me that you thought that it was going to provide a very useful service to legislators who were afraid to be seen talking to each other in the halls of Congress because of all of the, team polarization that goes on there, as a place where they could actually discuss things honestly. Is that happening?
So our model for that, of course, is the Quaker United Nations office, which has a house in which they do those offline conversations. And there is precedent. Joe Volk can tell more stories than I can about this, probably about FCNL being a spot where where elected officials felt safe to come to have a conversation that they felt they couldn't have in their own offices or in their office buildings. It is possible that it's happened, and I don't know, because I don't know everything that happens at FCNL anymore, which is fine. I am not aware that we are actually having members of Congress themselves come over for those conversations. What we have done is we've had a couple of structured conversations, and we did them. We've done a lot of work on this bipartisan climate solutions caucus, which was a Republican and a Democrat who joined the caucus. And so we had a couple conversations where we had a Republican and a Democrat talking specifically about climate change in the same space with an audience. but that was a public event. It wasn't an offline event. We've also had other events where we've invited members of Congress to come over, and we had a group, actually, not a group. It was after one of our silent reflections. We had a couple of people who are working on election reform, one in North Carolina and one in Texas, a Republican and Democrat, they were staffers, or one was a staffer and one was a expert person, come and talk, and have a discussion together with each other that we could participate in and understand and follow. So it's actually kind of hard to get them out of their offices. That is, that they are, they're pretty scripted in terms of their time. And so we have had, I'll tell you the other thing we've done is we had a couple dinners that Barbara Lee, who is a member from California, had contacted a couple of my colleagues, Barbara Williams Skinner, who works with African American lawmakers, and Sister Simone Campbell, who works with the Network Catholic Lobby, and talked about her concern that as this discussions that we were kind of losing the fact that under discussions of poverty, there was a huge issue of racism and racial injustice. And so she asked us to convene clergy to have that conversation. So we've had a couple dinners at the Quaker Welcome Center that have included members of Congress in that discussion. So it's like an offline discussion, but it's not necessarily the deep divisions kind of issue that have happened. We remain open for that should the opportunity arise. And so we continue to try to get the word out about the possibility to do that. Chris?
Hi, Diane. Chris Moore from Green Street Meeting and also Friends Center in Philadelphia. I'm thinking about the number of young people you engage through Friends Committee on National Legislation and how many of them may not identify as Quaker, but they're the present and future of Friends in many ways and of FCNL. wondering if you can think about thoughts for the future of FCNL and how to engage people on the general committee. Maybe they don't have formal membership in the Society of Friends. Are there new models we can look at?
I hope so. This is a live question, obviously, for many Quaker organizations. I mean, all of you who've involved with Quaker organizations and institutions look at this question. I look at the young adults who come to work with us and be with us, and really do think this is the future. You know, this is the future of the Religious Society of Friends, and I think, you know, I mean, there's any of you who've thought about this question of membership, you know, so let me just say, I come from kind of an old school view where becoming a member of my meeting was a big thing. You know, that was like that was a conviction, you know, and that was a marriage of a kind, right? You know, to do that. And I believe in that because I believe in that kind of commitment. But I also understand that's not for everybody. And increasingly, I think we see young adults, and, you know, Arthur and I were having this conversation over dinner about like this question of where people attach themselves and how they attach themselves, and how, you know, not so much how do we cultivate young people, but I think it's a live question that we have to think about, is how will people engage in religious practice, actually? I mean, not just the Religious Society of Friends, every church is asking this. How do people engage and feel a sense of community and a sense of spiritual connection, and not necessarily, you know, I mean, it happens differently for different people. So I feel like this is an opportunity for us in the Religious Society of Friends to really say, how will we be open and welcoming and affirming? And I think that means, you know, certainly, I'm sure you've been in circles where people talk about that means that we may not be able to be just like we are now, right? We may have to change our forms a little bit, and we may have to not have 8-hour meetings, which is what we do. I mean, we have a finance committee meeting, and it's an 8-hour meeting. You know, who can do that? I mean, you can do it if you're retired, right? So I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's going to change right away, but I do think that we have to be a little bit more nimble and open. And, you know, again, you know, when there was a time when people wouldn't talk about the term marketing in relation to Quakers. Well, those days have to be over. We have got to be out there. We have got to let people know who we are, what we do. You know, I mean, we're not on every social media platform, but we try to be on more of them. And we're pretty intentional about trying, and that's not just about young people, but it's just about the way we communicate too. So I'm actually, I mean, I know you're paying attention to this, Chris, and a lot of Quaker heads are thinking about this a lot, and a lot of people who sit on governance boards and committees think about this a lot too, and it's important. But I want to say, it's not just important to institutions; it's really important to meetings and Quaker churches, and that we are thinking about what happens, you know, because as a mother of children who grew up in Quaker meeting, I mean, they tell stories about how, like, you know, they show up, you know, someplace new, and they're like, you know, 20 years old, and there's a rush, right? Oh, we're so happy you're here, you know, or a person of color. I mean, it's the same thing. You can't, like, you got to kind of think about how do you create a welcoming space that isn't inappropriate and inappropriately enthusiastic, I guess, is the way to say that. So, I mean, I don't have a set answer for it, but I do think it's a question that we all ought to be considering. Question over here. I will also say, while we're coming to this question, we have had, I can't tell you how many, but young adults who've come to either work with FCNL or be part of our committees who are becoming Quakers. Membership Quakers.
This is a somewhat personal question to you.
And your name?
Paul Sheldon, Lansdowne Meeting. Thank you. I hope I can ask you to say it with appropriate humility. You were speaking early on about now sort of being able to identify as a prophetic voice or a prophetic witness. And I have heard that applied to myself on certain occasions, particularly my connection at Villanova University. And being there is quite different from talking to a group of Quakers. This weekend I was in Ethics of War conference. Villanova has the largest naval academic unit outside of Annapolis. The conference was co-sponsored by the West Point Military Academy, so I was feet on the ground with a lot of military personnel. I want to lead into things rather gently there, but eventually it all came out. But you don't open with, I'm a Quaker pacifist. But after a while, they hear me very nicely, and then they say, we really appreciate your prophetic voice. And that is basically dismissive. So I've heard that a number of times at Villanova. I started off saying, oh, I'm not a prophetic voice. And then people said it nice, and I thought, well, maybe I am. But now I'm starting to think, no, I am suggesting things you could do right now. We could have a discussion on, is it appropriate for a Christian institution to support a military unit on its campus? Let's discuss that. Well, is that prophetic or is that no, I don't have the same good feeling toward prophetic voice. It seems dismissive, perhaps. So I don't know how you'll go along with that. Thank you.
It's a great, I appreciate the question, thank you. And I want to say, I mean, this book that Marge Abbott just published, had published about everyday prophets, really has been enlightening for me to think about, the idea that if you are naming what, I mean, as I understand this and what I believe is that if you are naming a situation of what could be, that is consistent with the gospel, that is consistent with what is the kingdom of God, which is really what we as originally as friends were called to be in, to live into the kingdom of God. And if you're naming that in this day and age, I mean, it's not prophetic as in this future is going to make a change. It's prophetic in this is what is possible. And it's not like the plan to become possible. I mean, I think about the things that, there are people here who have worked on issues for decades and know the answers, know what the answers could be if we would have the political support to take those actions. And so I think to me, it's a kind of truth telling that is not condemning, but is naming what we understand to be truth and to be in order with the spirit of God. I'm not sure how else to say that, and that's a complex thing to say with a group of military leaders, and I think there's a lot of prophetic witness that gets dismissed all the time. I mean, I think the nature of it is to be dismissive because it's hard. It's hard to be so outside of what we've allowed, to be a mainstream way of being, that, which is why the community of support is so essential and prayer is so essential. And coming back to, our grounding is so essential. And that's why I feel like I don't think Quakers are the only ones that have this tradition, but I think our tradition is very rich in that idea of the deep listening that allows us to speak the truth that we come to know and understand, and to do it within a community of people that help us test it and affirm it. And that can apply to lots of things, not just political action. It can apply to, a work situation. And so I thank you. I thank you for being a truth teller on that campus, on this issue. Jonathan?
Jonathan Evans, Westtown Meeting. So Diane, as you know, I started my journey with FCNL in the 1970s, high school, college years. And among my community of saints or prophets, if you will, were people like Miriam and Sam Levering, who were year after year coming from Southwest Virginia to Washington, D.C. to lobby for the Law of the Seas Treaty. And I think they saw themselves, and I learned to see them as part of a group of Quakers in a much wider community who were continuing what had happened in the wake of two horrible world wars. In the wake of World War II, putting in place the Geneva Conventions, the United Nations, international law for shared security. And my concern now is that we're going in the other direction. The way I see it, we are dismantling. It's a structural sin, to pick up your term. We are dismantling that piece by piece. So I was lobbying for UN peacekeeping, including in the Middle East. And our president has just declared that we should support Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights in total contradiction against international law. So I'm trying to find hope these days, and I wonder if you could just comment on what FCNL is doing these days in the area of foreign policy and multilateral diplomacy, international law.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we have focused on peace-building programs, as you know, and trying to help create structures in the U.S. government that would be able to prevent violent conflict before it happens. That said, I think even those who work within the U.S. government recognize that when violent conflict starts happening, we have more limitations, and that's very problematic. So to the extent that we can keep trying to look at the prevention of violent conflict, it's hugely important. And yet there are these deep and long and growing escalation of conflicts that seem incredibly difficult to extricate ourselves from. And certainly, the U.S., the current administration's attitude toward diplomacy has done a lot to tear those, to tear that fabric apart about diplomatic relations. And if you talk to people who work at the State Department, people are very concerned. There are many foreign service officers have left. The ranks are thinning. The competency is waning, and it's a tough time for diplomacy. The leadership chooses to focus on, I said it in my remarks, but the pulling out of the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal, was just, the height of foolishness. I don't know. Such a small portion of people thought that was a worthwhile thing to do. So it's hard to know. And so it's a little bit heartening to hear at least some of the candidates running for president now are saying they would put us back into that, which is really important. I think this question about international law is a really interesting one because to me, it also goes to the question of what's happening around the globe with, nationalist leaders. It's not only in the U.S. that we have this kind of white nationalism or sort of a sense of nationalism that some people think borders on fascism. Brazil, Philippines, Poland, Hungary. There's so many places. And so I think there's a really interesting phenomenon particularly around the issue of international law and what can be done. And the idea of continuing to, so I think that what we can do is continue to educate people and to continue to expose people to opportunities for both, showing up in places where they understand that you're a world traveler, you've lived in many places around the globe. Not everyone has, and so they don't understand those differences. What I think FCNL can do is to continue to find the voices of members of Congress who will speak up and who will counter this. But as you know, administration has a lot of say over foreign policy. And so there's a limit to how much can be done. But I think the more that we can have senators, particularly those senators who serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, willing to speak out on it. Republicans control the Senate right now, so there's only a limit that they can do, but to have the House Foreign Affairs Committee, to have them have hearings on these issues, to push forward bills like the Yemen bill, these are all steps that we're taking, that we can take. But, and we, the other thing that you're familiar with is that one of the ways that we lobby is to have statements that are signed on to by a number of organizations. And certainly on the Golan, issue, we have a statement that somebody else wrote it that we signed on to, but on many of these. And that it doesn't reverse it, but it does give voice to an alternative narrative, which I think is the minimum of what we can do. And we're open to ideas.
I think we have time for one more question.
They're getting harder. These questions are getting harder.
That's why we're going to have one more.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Maurice Eldridge, Swarthmore Friends meeting. I struggle with falling into judgmental anger, and at the same time wish there were ways to help these people who are who are there to represent us in decision-making settings, how to help them rediscover or reconnect to their own moral centers. This is what really plagues me, and I don't enjoy personally being angry in this degree so much of the time, and that's not productive at all. And being judgmental in a way that says I'm shutting out my recognition that we share a common character as human beings. So this is a dilemma, and in the work that you're doing, and the place that you're doing it, and that your staff and all of those are doing it, confront this chasm of immorality that people have fallen into, who have a job to do that they're not doing, therefore. I don't know if there's a question in that. It's just...
So what's interesting to me, I will say something about the office culture at FCNL. You don't really hear, you might like in a personal one-on-one conversation, but in a meeting or a conversation about our work, no one's bad-mouthing members of Congress. We understand that even if we disagree with members, they have a job that they're doing. And there's a respect for the elective office, and there's a respect for that job. Now, we may, again, disagree with how they go about doing it or their policies. So I think that's a pretty healthy culture to be in for an area where there's a lot of partisan division. I also want to say that I don't assume that certainly everyone on the entire staff and certainly our governing committee all are in lockstep unity on every single issue. There's we're probably all more closely aligned, but there's differences, and so I think that's important, just in recognizing that, just as there are differences in how we believe about what we believe about God or our own religious life, there are differences in our political lives too, and so I think that's important to respect. I will tell you that I have really struggled with my own sense of anger after the 2016 election, and I was so deeply offended as a woman about the election of Donald Trump, and I continue to be. I mean, it is, let alone many other issues, I find it particularly problematic, and I feel like we'll just say and share with you that I feel like the the personal behavior, and his willingness to say things that I find very bullying in tone, lead to, they're just such, they're such an awful example, but they can lead to obviously bad behavior. And so that for me is hugely problematic. I think it's also important to remember that while the executive holds significant power, as we talked about over foreign policy, and can make huge changes, such as dismantling the Department of Environmental Protection or around budget, there are other branches of our democracy. And in Congress, whatever our frustrations are, they are the people we elect to represent us. And so it is incumbent on us to be in dialogue with them. That is our responsibility as citizens. And being an effective citizen is more than voting. So I say that to people, that they think a little bit about where is that I will make that engagement with my elected officials. It's also true that there are bipartisan agreements and bills moving forward every week in Washington, D.C. that you don't read about. They aren't on the Rachel Maddow show or whoever the Fox News person is, because I never watch that network, I can't tell you. But even though we may feel some sense of frustration because of what's in the news cycle, there is work that's happening that is positive and good work, and I want to say amazing work, continuing to be done by many federal workers. And there's a lot of people thanking vets for their service. I now thank people who work in the federal government for their service, because it's often a thankless job, and what they do is incredibly important. I'll tell you just one really quick story. Some people in here know Bridget Moix, who is our clerk of our general committee now. And Bridget had worked at FCNL for a number of years, and she had, I went to a brunch at her house about a year ago. It was kind of a gathering of women that was delightful to be at. And one of them was a woman who I had not met before. She works for the National Security Council, and someone asked her, well, what's it like, to be working, because the National Security Council is like in the White House offices, right? What's it like to be working there right now? And she said, under President Obama, we had this, we would chafe at how long things took to get through because of the bureaucracy. And she said, now we're really grateful for that bureaucracy, because it's slowed down some things that could have been worse. So, we're think of that, but so that's where it's like the churn of government isn't instantaneous always, even though the reaction in the media is. And so I do think the role, and that's a whole different topic that is fascinating to think about, but the role of media in our political life has obviously had significant impact and dramatic changes to all kinds of ways that we behave. And so this question of searching for the truth becomes even more significant and important. So
thank you. It's weird standing for someone else's applause. I'm sort